In order to help us understand how language is networked through the brain, rather than isolated in individual chunks or locations in the brain, Sedivy gives us a really good analogy. She tells us to imagine the brain as a complex of commercial activity in which the makers of different products have arranged to share resources and their workers' expertise whenever possible. For instance, like the same factory could handle the production of both fish sticks and chicken fingers, given that they rely on similar procedures. And the packaging of lots of different kinds of goods might take place in a different area, bringing together all kinds of frozen foods that go into boxes, like fish sticks and chicken fingers and miniature quiches and hamburger patties, all in the same place. The benefit of this kind of processing would be that individual factories wouldn't have to be duplicated. If chicken fingers and fish sticks require the same kind of equipment and materials in order to process, then they could be done in the same factory and you wouldn't have to duplicate factories. The drawback of such an approach would be that there might be lots more shipping going on. If you had first built your factory next to the fishery in order to process the fish sticks, and you wanted to process chicken fingers in the same factory, then you would have to ship the chicken meat from the chicken farm to the fishery, to the factory that's next to the fishery, and there would be a lot more shipping going on, but you wouldn't have to duplicate factories. Sedivy suggests that this is much how the brain works. Rather than having an isolated brain region where all of a specific part of speech is processed and produced, we have individual factories that deal with isolated aspects of speech that are located all across the brain, and we have to ship our parts of speech across vast networks in the brain. So you can see a good pictorial model on page 81 of how that might work. One side note here that I wanted to make mention of is the fact that when we process information in what's called the phonological loop, or in other words, when we keep repeating something subvocally to ourselves, like a phone number, from the time we look at it in the phone book to the time that we dial it on our phone, that ability to say over and over again the same 7 digits, like 8675309, 8675309, 8675309, that repetition of digits is processed in the brain by a rapid juggling process from Wernicke's area to Broca's area, back to Wernicke's area to Broca's area, just as you see those dark red arrows depicting between the two regions. So the production area, which is Broca's area, is allowing us to repeat to ourselves the words, but Wernicke's area is allowing us to hear those words ourselves. If you were to stop rehearsing any part of that sequence of digits, it would fall out of your memory almost immediately. Another piece of evidence that suggests to us that language is processed in vast regions across the brain, and not exclusively in linguistic areas of the brain, is that found in figure 3.11 on page 83. Here we see that lists of verbs that are performed by the foot region will activate foot regions of the motor cortex, that those actions that are performed by the fingers are processed in part by the finger areas of the motor cortex, and that those words that are performed by the tongue are processed in the tongue region of the motor cortex. You would not think that the brain would activate in much the same fashion while reading words subvocally, just in your head, as if you were to actually perform those actions. But that's what we see in language processing in the brain. Now, not only do we see individual areas of the brain responsible for production and comprehension, in other words, Wernicke's and Broca's areas, we also see that there are different pathways that process information about what and information about how. For instance, in processing the word sit, an individual would have to piece together the individual sounds, s, it, and understand that those are not the same sounds as might appear in a very similar word like set, s-et. The individual would also have to take the meaning of that word as a cohesive whole and map that meaning onto the linguistic speech that's being processed. The first part of what I described is the how. How is this word said? How is it produced? The second part is what. What does the word mean? And recent research suggests that these two aspects of processing a word are performed in different tracts of the brain, that there's a dorsal stream and a ventral stream, and the information about how the word is processed along the top of our brain in the dorsal stream, and the information about the semantics of the word, what it means, are processed on a dorsal stream. Interestingly, this has an analogy in that our visual processing works in much the same way. You might be tempted to think that looking at an image of a pencil would be a pretty simple, straightforward process, but we actually have two streams that process different aspects of the pencil. One is the how stream, how do we use this object, and the other is the what stream, what is the object. And people can sustain damage to one or the other of these paths and be able to understand what an object is for without being able to identify it, or be able to identify it but not be able to say what it's for. Going back to the analogy of the commercial factories for a moment, this can help us understand the reason why we have so many pathways throughout the brain where linguistic information is processed. It's most probable that we evolved cognitive structures in our brain for the purpose of doing some cognitive thing, and that we've co-opted these individual areas in order to use during linguistic processing. And because we've had these factories already established, already evolved in our history, and we had to co-opt them, we have a lot of pathways, a lot of transporting of material to get across from factory to factory as individual bits of linguistic information are processed in the brain. It's for this reason that it appears we use the same exact networks in the brain to process signed language as we would to process spoken language. That used to be a very counterintuitive finding because we used to think that individuals speaking signed languages were actually just using advanced gestural or miming kind of techniques, that they weren't using syntax or grammar, that they were rather just using ways of acting out what they wanted to communicate. This, of course, would assume that sign languages could not communicate something more abstract, something that wasn't actually able to be performed in the physical world. But sign languages are capable of communicating very abstract kinds of things. They do follow their own syntax and grammar, and when they're processed in the brain, they're processed in a very different way from gestures. The study that I'm talking about here is on page 88, where some researchers had hearing individuals perform a gestural movement that looked as if it would be the kind of gesture you would use when presented with an object, a hammer or a bottle of syrup. And even though the gestures that were performed by hearing individuals were very similar to the exact signs that were used by people who spoke American Sign Language, the brain activation that reflected those individual movements, that the behaviors were almost exactly the same, but the brain activation was vastly different for those who were treating that gesture as if it were a word, as opposed to those hearing individuals who were treating it as if it were just a mime. This leads us to a very interesting topic of paralinguistic uses of modes of communication. Consider for a moment how often you've been talking to a friend and caught yourself moving your hands in an animated fashion. I'm in fact doing that right now as I record this audio lecture. By moving your hands around, you aren't communicating some piece of information that you would be unable to communicate using words. By the fact that you can't see my hands moving around, you don't understand any less of what I'm saying than you would if I was recording a video of myself and you could see my hands moving around. So for that reason, the movement of my hands is paralinguistic. Para, of course, you know as a root word, similar to paraeducator or paralegal. It's something that is a helper to or alongside of, but isn't linguistic in its very nature. So hand movements are, in English, paralinguistic, but in sign language they are very much linguistic. The point is further driven home by a comparison of the differences in uses of tones in Chinese compared to English. In Chinese, the same word ma can be used with 4 different tones and mean 4 different things depending on the tone that's used. In English, if I were to say the exact same word but as a rising tone versus a falling tone, then you would take that to mean that I had a questioning attitude. Like if I were to say, will you come and sit? Will you come and sit? If I use the tone, a rising tone at the end of a sentence, it means something different than if I use a falling tone, but only in a peripheral manner. The words themselves don't shift. Rather, the only thing that's shifting is my meaning, my intention or my attitude about that sentence. In Chinese, a difference in tone will mean a very different semantic meaning. So rather than tones being paralinguistic, which is what they are in English, in Chinese, tones are actually linguistic. They're built into part of the semantic meaning of words. Now, the reason why Sedivy describes paralinguistic aspects of language here at this part of the chapter is because paralinguistic components of language appear to be processed in the right hemisphere of the brain. Things like intonation, like how things were said, and also the ability to pull together individual sentences into a very large story or into discourse, the fact that you're able to follow the whole sequence of everything I'm saying in this lecture, that's paralinguistic, and it's processed in the right hemisphere of the brain. So just to make sure we're really clear, individuals who are native speakers of English who make a gesture will process that gesture in the right hemisphere of the brain, whereas individuals who are deaf will process the exact same movement in the left hemisphere, in the language centers of the brain. Individuals who are native speakers of English will process tones in the right hemisphere of the brain, whereas native speakers of Chinese will process tones in the left hemisphere, in the language centers of the brain. And finally, as the text describes, there are some languages that use clicks in the middle of their words as semantic parts of words, whereas we use clicks in the middle of our speech, like something like that, to separate between paragraphs. They would use clicks in the middle of their words. Our clicks would be processed in the right hemisphere of the brain. Their clicks would be processed in the language centers in the left hemisphere of the brain.